Thank you all who are here in person and the many guests that we have online for joining us here this morning at the Center for American Progress. I'm Patrick Gaspard, the President and CEO of CAP, and I'm delighted, really delighted to join all of you, but to also be joined by the Director of the White House National Economic Council, Dr. Lael Brainard, who you'll hear from momentarily. We had occasion to host Dr. Brainard just some weeks ago when we released our women's report, the impact of women in this current economy. She joined us then, and she has been a fellow traveler for quite some time, and we are just really giddy to have her here. Our country's relationship with China will be the dominant phenomena in shaping global outcomes in this century. One of this generation's keystone challenges will be to foster productive economic and diplomatic relationships across our government and cultural and ideological differences. Our economies are, of course, interconnected. Our supply chains need many of the same resources, and the world's most pressing issues, from climate change to pandemics to vast inequality, cannot be addressed in a fulsome manner without the United States and China, of course, working with one another. But on issue after issue, from the emergence of AI to social media, and from Taiwan to Ukraine, sharp differences in value, interest surface forcefully from time to time, creating some fictions. Enduring solutions are, of course, impossible without meaningful collaborations between the two countries across those differences. That's why just a few short weeks ago, CAP proposed a comprehensive strategy towards China policy that lays out a smart and principled approach for managing this pivotal relationship. The approach doesn't involve bending to China's whims or wishes or weakening our support for American workers. Instead, the strategy uses every single tool in our toolbook to protect our manufacturers, our workers, and our people from predatory competition fueled by China's non-market practices. Effective protection requires smart, targeted trade actions. And our team was pleased to see the administration's tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, solar technologies, batteries, and critical minerals announced earlier this week. These tariffs will ensure the strength of American manufacturing. The tariffs build on the unprecedented investments this administration has made at home towards rebuilding our country's infrastructure and our manufacturing industry. Thanks to the Biden administration and Dr. Brainard, American manufacturing is growing once again, modernizing for the first time in generations and creating a foundation of U.S. global competitiveness for decades to come. It's my distinct honor to welcome Dr. Brainard, who serves as the director of the NEC, back to our space. We're really, as I said before, thrilled to have her here. Before she took the reins at the NEC, she was a member of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors from 2014 to 2022 and served as its vice chair from 2022 to 2023. Dr. Brainard, I hope you will forgive me for noting that during your time on the Board of Governors, many of us really appreciated and rallied to your forceful defense of banking standards and regulations that we thought really accrued to the benefit of the average American. So we appreciate you for your courage there. An accomplished scholar and public servant, Dr. Brainard's career spans academia, the private sector, and high-level public office, establishing her as a true authority on U.S.-China economic relations. Let's all extend a warm CAP welcome to the Director of the National Economic Council, Dr. Lael Brainard.
Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome. It is really a pleasure to join you today at the Center for American Progress. Today, I do want to focus on the president's investment agenda and the trade enforcement that is necessary to make sure American jobs and American investment are not undercut by unfair trade practices from China. The president came to office with a plan to grow the economy from the middle out and the bottom up. It's a sharp departure from the trickle-down approach of the prior administration. And on his watch, we are seeing record investment in clean energy and advanced manufacturing. That investment has to be paired with trade enforcement to make sure it is not undercut by a flood of unfairly underpriced exports from China. Earlier this week, the president announced important enforcement under Section 301 of our trade laws to raise tariffs against China's unfair trade practices in vital industries of the future. Today, the administration is taking additional action to prevent circumvention of those tariffs in the solar industry. After inheriting an economy with millions out of work, broken supply chains, and a surge of inflation from the pandemic, the president secured major legislation that has supported a strong domestic demand-led recovery. We saw the unacceptably high cost of relying on a single foreign source for critical inputs when the dramatic supply shocks associated with the pandemic and Russia's war on Ukraine caused a surge of inflation here in the US and widespread shortages. The president's historic investment laws, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, are strengthening the supply side of our economy. Private sector investments in manufacturing plants are at record highs, reversing disinvestment in the previous administration, and manufacturing employment is up by 800,000 after declining during the previous administration. But today, at a time when a strong U.S. recovery is underway, powered by domestic consumption and investment, there are signs that China is exporting its way to recovery. China is using the same playbook it has before to power its growth at the expense of others by investing in significant industrial overcapacity and flooding global markets with artificially cheap exports. We saw what happened when the first China shock harmed factory towns all over our country. 12 years ago, here at the Center for American Progress, I discussed my concerns that China's unbalanced investment and export-driven growth was imposing costs on America and on the globe. At the time, I said that only by moving from an economy dependent on external demand and exports to one driven by domestic consumer demand could China achieve its long-term growth goals consistent with broader global growth. Today, China's share of global manufacturing is approaching 30%, enabled by a combination of non-market practices, including forced technology transfer and intellectual property theft, discriminatory rules, and subsidies that are much higher in China than elsewhere. Since investment has been redirected away from China's property sector, state banks have been encouraged to provide underpriced credit to sectors prioritized by the central government. The U.S. Trade Representative's Section 301 report on China documents evidence and cites sources from around the world of ways that China acquires foreign technology through forced transfers, cyber theft, and other means. But today, China is simply too big to play by its own rules. As noted in that USTR report, China now produces 70% of the world's electric vehicles, accounts for over 80% of battery manufacturing capacity, and controls around twice as much 50 to 180 nanometer semiconductor manufacturing capacity as the next largest producer. By the end of this year, the global supply of solar panels is expected to outpace global demand by roughly threefold, driven by Chinese policies to continue expanding investment despite overcapacity in China and sharply declining global prices. China's industrial overcapacity undermines market-based innovation and investment, as well as our workers and supply chains. Markets need reliable demand signals and fair competition for the best firms to innovate and invest. But China's massive investments in electric vehicles, solar panels, and batteries are the result of an explicit government strategy to capture these sectors. By undercutting global prices for these goods, China's policy-driven overcapacity disrupts the demand signal that's vital for market-based investment. And of course, if firms cannot safeguard the intellectual property they develop, it undercuts market-based incentives to invest in innovation in the first place. Second, a new cycle of Chinese policy-driven overcapacity and export surges could have adverse consequences for our workers. Analysis suggests the first China shock was associated with the loss of over 1 million manufacturing jobs here in America. We will use legitimate enforcement tools to make sure a second China shock does not happen again. Third, the concentration in China of control over high value-added components of supply chains for key industries could undermine our supply chain resilience. We know that supply chains that are overly dependent on a few nodes are susceptible to geographically localized shocks, and we saw that during the pandemic. In response, the president's agenda combines investment in industries of the future with enforcement of our trade laws to give our workers and businesses a fair chance to compete. Imposing tariffs in selective sectors under Section 301 of our trade laws ensures that investment and jobs in EVs, batteries, vital medical equipment, steel and aluminum, semiconductors, and solar, spurred by the president's historic laws, are not undercut by a flood of unfairly underpriced exports from China. Last year, China exported 5 million electric and gasoline vehicles, becoming the world's largest auto exporter. And those numbers are expected to increase dramatically again this year. Similarly, the subsidized production of electrical vehicle batteries is so high that China is expected to produce nearly 4 times its domestic demand. The IRA and the infrastructure law include important programs to encourage domestic investment along the supply chain for lower emissions vehicles, along with consumer incentives. So tariffs on Chinese electrified vehicles will be increased to 100% to prevent a surge of unfairly underpriced exports to enable automakers and auto workers in the U.S. to compete fairly. Tariffs will be increased to 25% on batteries and battery components to diversify supply chains and provide incentives to develop new technologies. In the solar sector, bolstered by the IRA, the private sector is undertaking record investments all around America. China dominates more than 70% of all segments of the solar supply chain and 97% of global silicon wafer capacity. Its loss-leading production and investment threaten to drive out foreign producers that must meet market return hurdles. To guard against that, tariffs on Chinese solar cells and panels will be increased to 50%. And in addition, today we're imposing a 14.25% tariff on bifacial solar modules and ending the solar bridge on time in order to ensure against circumvention. Today's announcement will also help to clarify guidance on domestic content for the solar supply chain under the IRA. In semiconductors, within the next 3 years, China could control nearly 40% of the world's production of legacy chips. That would result in risky concentration of manufacturing for semiconductors that are used to power everyday technologies we all depend on, including for national security. After decades in which America stood by while its manufacturing moved abroad in response to foreign subsidies, the CHIPS and Science Act is enabling businesses to invest in semiconductor manufacturing in America again for the first time in decades. And tariffs on Chinese legacy semiconductors will increase to 50% to enforce against a surge of unfairly underpriced Chinese imports. Today, we're at a turning point. The president is leading the way on an approach that invests in America and stands up for American workers and businesses against Chinese unfair practices, following years of trickle-down policies that hollowed out too many factory towns. We've learned from the past there can be no second China shock here in America. Of course, the administration is committed to responsibly managing competition with China. We're committed to cooperating with China to meet the world's most pressing challenges, including on the path to net zero. But in parallel, it is important to enforce our trade laws against China's unfair non-market practices to prevent harm to our workers and businesses. Many foreign partners have initiated or publicly discussed trade actions of a similar nature, and we are working with G7 and G20 partners to advance our common interests. China's industrial footprint today is more complex than it was during the previous export surge, and today's actions to support U.S. solar manufacturing will help ensure that China can't undercut manufacturing here simply by moving its exports or factories. In negotiating the USMCA, the previous administration didn't adequately address the potential transshipment of Chinese exports entering the U.S. market via Mexico. So we're looking forward to working with Mexico to address concerns that some Chinese steel exports appear to be flowing through Mexico, and some Chinese auto companies may be considering exporting through Mexico. The USMCA review in 2026 provides a further opportunity to address these potential risks. The president's tough, targeted approach, combining investment and enforcement in key sectors, is a sharp departure from the prior administration. The previous administration did not take action to invest in America and failed to follow through on securing the promises that Chinese made to make purchases or end its unfair practices in the failed Phase 1 trade agreement. And the president opposes current Republican proposals to impose across-the-board tariffs on all goods from all countries because they would cost an average American family $1,500 every year, according to analysis done here at CAP. The president has long believed in a middle-out, bottom-up approach to growing the economy, and he's secured historic legislation to make it happen. That approach is providing a model of how to deliver sustainable growth with good jobs and smart investment. But for it to succeed, it is vital to enforce the rules that safeguard healthy, market-driven competition. Thank you very much.
Dr. Brainard, thank you so very much for those incredibly important remarks and for the announcement. And thank you for the plug on CAP's own research about the impact of the across-the-board tariff proposed by a certain candidate for President of the United States. You said quite a lot there, and as you were speaking, I was furiously taking notes and trying to keep up and understand and realizing that I had many questions that I had to shift as a result of much of what you just said. I want to, if I can, go to the salient points that you made a dozen years ago here when you joined John Podesta in conversation at CAP, and you noted then your concerns about what the impact could be in the long term on the U.S. and on our manufacturing industry and on our workers from the influx of cheap Chinese imports. You noted the China shock, which landed on our shores sometime at around 2008. But can you help our audience understand precisely what we mean by that and why it's so darn important? You said that there were a little bit more than 1 million workers that were displaced as a consequence of the China shock. But we all know that there are about 1.5 million workers almost every other day that are displaced in our current economy. But can you help everyone understand the reason why this was so profound because of how focused and targeted it was, and how the place-based investments that this administration is making now is shoring us up against future shocks?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you for the great research that you're doing. Please keep it coming. We are avid consumers. In terms of the China shock, I think everyone around the country observed locations close to where they lived where factories were shutting down, people were out of work, the nature of employment completely changed, particularly in areas that were very concentrated in certain manufacturing industries. But what really brought it, I think, home was some research that showed that this was a significant shock, cost 1 million manufacturing jobs around the country. And as you said, very concentrated in factory towns that had been oriented around good middle-class jobs, often union jobs associated with factories, with manufacturing, that concentrated geographically. And when those jobs left during a time when public, under trickle-down economic policies, public investment also was declining. And as a result, you saw a cycle of disinvestment in factory towns all across the country. James Fallows has written very eloquently about this phenomenon. What we've been trying to do, in addition to taking very seriously the need to prevent a second China shock by fully exercising our trade laws, by investing, is having policies that ensure that those investments around the country get special incentives to be in communities that have suffered disinvestment. So we have for the first time, special tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act that make it significantly more attractive to locate investments in former energy communities, communities that may have been very focused on energy sources that are declining as a share of the mix. And so those same locations are now getting a lot of clean energy investments because of that added bonus. Lower income communities, the Treasury has done a great report showing that the lower income bonus is also directing investments to places where employment was low and disinvestment was high. And we are seeing what we call comeback communities all around the country in places like Allentown, where participation in the labor force is up, small business creation is up, employment is up, investment is up, and in part because of directed place-based policies, and in part just because we have a very strong recovery.
That's great. I'm going to press in just a little further, only because I've heard you speak powerfully about what the China shock meant in places like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and how that specifically helped to hollow out the Black middle class in that town. I wonder if you might say a few more things about that.
Yeah, so I think certainly in my visits to Milwaukee, some of these shocks were particularly concentrated on minority communities who were economically really devastated by the loss of manufacturing jobs. So the 30th Street Industrial Corridor in Milwaukee, if you look at employment, jobs, manufacturing investment was just extremely damaged by the China shock. And it's taken years to develop a set of policies. And of course, under President Biden, we have infrastructure investments in lead pipes, for instance, that are both improving water quality, but also giving opportunities to small businesses, minority small businesses like Hero Plumbing, to come in and invest. And so you're seeing there's recompete money flowing to try to reconnect people to job opportunities through transportation, to try to bring those communities which were once so vital back and make them vital once again.
That's inspiring. So there are no shortage of challenges that you and our president are taking on right now, from climate change to the technological revolution to economic inclusion to the rise of autocracies around the world. Help us. Can you just kind of telescope out and help us understand how these tariffs are braided through the overall strategy across this suite of challenges and opportunities?
Yeah. So for President Biden, it's really important to demonstrate that he is a president who is fighting for our workers. when we saw the first China shock, there was a slowness in recognizing just how profound it was, and a reluctance to use the full suite of trade enforcement tools. But also, there were no tools on the investment side. I think what President Biden has uniquely done is coupled this very robust investment agenda, chips and science, in semiconductors and advanced manufacturing and innovation, bipartisan infrastructure law, because we actually need to revitalize infrastructure. It's been neglected for so long, including by the last president, who actually didn't do anything there, and clean energy transition. So you have a proactive investment agenda that is coupled with a real commitment to standing up and fighting for our workers, for our businesses, so that we don't allow that kind of surge of unfairly priced exports from China to come in and wipe out those really important industries of the future.
I'm so glad you mentioned the fact that despite all the rhetoric, there was a failure to actually follow up properly on enforcement, to have this all ladder up into effective policy to shore up our industrial sector and workers in the previous administration. Some of us know a little secret about you, Lael. We know that despite the fact that you are at the tip of the spear on economic policy, that you really made your way into this policy world through foreign policy. I was excited to hear the things that you said about Mexico and the kind of partnership we have to take up with the Mexican government, if this is going to be effective at all, and our partnerships with Europe. Can you talk about the framework of partnership as it relates to the effectiveness both of these tariffs and the set of industrial investments that this president has made?
So I would say that we are working very closely with our trade partners around the world. We're not uniquely seeing this set of risks from China. Europe is extremely concerned about them. Brazil is taking action. India, this is a widely held set of concerns that China, which has the capacity, it is an enormous domestic market. It can use policies to really drive growth through its domestic consumer, which is the kind of growth that you see here in the US. Instead of doing that, relying on an old playbook that does not work at the scale that China is, and is so concentrated on its targeted industries that it really poses a material threat, not just to clean energy investments and advanced manufacturing here in the US, but in Europe and all around the world. So that's why we're working with our partners. The president is very committed. He's also taking a very different approach. Again, if you look at, these are very focused on unfair practices, intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer undertaken by China. In contrast, and they're in a very few sectors, in contrast to other proposals to impose a 10% tariff on all countries, even those that are playing by the rules, on all goods, which is just a huge tax on American consumers of about $1,500. So very different approach here.
So if you work in this space, you're always thinking about supply chain resilience and how versus national security, or supply chain resilience and how it meets questions of national security. Those things are not always completely aligned. I wonder how you might describe the alignment specifically around the CHIPS investment, which are really transformational for the industry and for our country.
Yeah, so chips and science, just in the last month and a half, we've had probably 5 or 6 major announcements of, $350 billion roughly investments in leading edge manufacturing of semiconductors here in the US. And don't forget, we invented the semiconductor here in the US. We had a lot of manufacturing, but as other governments subsidized in Asia and around the world, but really in Asia, all of that manufacturing went abroad. In fact, we only have 2% of leading edge chip manufacturing here in the US. And the Semiconductor Industry Association just put out a report saying that with these investments, these policies, that will rise to 40% over less than 10 years. That's important because these chips go into all of our national security systems, but you also saw that some of the legacy chips were really important just for day-to-day purchases. And when we did not have access to those semiconductors because a factory in China or somewhere else in Asia shut down, you saw people on waiting lists for washing machines and automobiles, and a third of the inflation in 2021 coming from semiconductor shortages. Huge illustration of why supply chain resilience is a national security issue, it's an economic issue, and why we now have so much work through our supply chain council, making sure we have resilient supply chain with more diversified sources of things like semiconductors.
Can I challenge you to be a prognosticator? Can you just forecast out over the course of the next 10 years or so what success might look like as a consequence of these chips investments next 10 years, next 20 years? Help the average person understand what the material benefit will look like for them, their community, and the nation.
Yeah, so these chips investments are all over the country. We just celebrated one in Minnesota, Oregon, Arizona, Texas, upstate New York, central New York, really New Hampshire. We're seeing semiconductor investments. And what happens with these semiconductor investments in the short run, of course, is great construction jobs, unionized construction jobs. And over the long run, a broader innovation ecosystem with highly skilled technical education in high schools and combining with community colleges, often with unions to create registered apprenticeships. You have, in certain cases, we're actually sponsoring workforce hubs in Syracuse and Phoenix to make those connections stronger. And what you see is the same kind of ecosystems of innovation, manufacturing, employment developing so that in 10 years you have suppliers coming in and you have unrelated small businesses providing services. So, Main Street gets revitalized. You have a whole number of investments and opportunities that get connected with these ecosystems that are also strengthening our national security and our economy.
I have a number of other questions about specific points of policy as a consequence of the announcements made by you and the president. But I want to, if I can, I want to pull back and lift up China itself and through the lens of your own personal biography and your journey. When you made your remarks earlier, you spoke about China's resistance to transforming from an economy that relies overwhelmingly on production, on exporting cheap products into our nation and other parts of the world. And you talked about their resistance to transition towards a consumer-driven economy. You were born. You're the daughter of a Foreign Service officer. You were born in Poland during the Cold War. You were raised in Germany before realignment occurred. You have, and I'm pretty sure you're seeing your thesis on utopias and social planning.
Okay.
So we know some things about you.
That's impressive.
We know some things about you.
That's my college thesis.
Yeah, we know your college senior thesis. So I just wonder, through the lens of your experience behind the Iron Curtain, your sense of open and closed societies, how you're thinking about China in this moment, the set of decisions it has in front of it, whether or not it's capable even of self-correction and reform in this space, and how our policies might be able to drive that reform, given your understanding of what it's like to be in closed autocratic societies.
Yeah, so that's a big question. I would say that I certainly have seen the transformation of, a communist country into a democracy and, a thriving market-based economy. And I am a strong, strong believer in open societies, democracy, and really the kind of dynamism and innovation that can come from markets. So China has a whole host of complicated historical and cultural things that are very specific to it. It will chart its own course, of course. But I think the president is really committed. China is such an important actor on the global stage. It's such an important member of the international community. We need to work well with China. We need to responsibly manage the relationship. We have global challenges that we both acknowledge that both countries are vital partners in addressing. But its approach to its own economic development is kind of moving backwards rather than forwards. Again, China has a enormous, vibrant consumer base. It could very much grow on the back of that strong domestic consumer and the kind of model that the U.S. Shows can work very well. But falling back on this playbook of relying on these very directed investments, massive intellectual property theft, discriminatory regulations in order to dominate certain sectors, building up overcapacity, continuing to invest even when overcapacity is pretty acute. That is not market-based investment. And then the kind of flooding international markets with underpriced exports playbook, it just is not one that is good for global growth, and it's not one that's acceptable for the president for America.
So let's you raised overcapacity. Let's talk about overcapacity, but let's talk about it specifically as it relates to climate. Climate has received outsized coverage with the announcement of these tariffs because of the impact on the electric vehicle industry, but also because of the attempt to address China's overcapacity in steel and aluminum, because of how those industries are so carbon intensive in China. Can you help us to understand how addressing that is helping us make progress on the climate crisis?
Yeah, so here we have really substantial programs that were secured in legislation by the president to invest in decarbonization. This is critically important as part of our broader overall net zero progress. And already the Department of Energy has allocated about $6 billion to these initiatives, $1.5 billion in steel and aluminum. We heard from one of the manufacturers the other day just how exciting this is, how much opportunity there is, how committed our businesses are, our workers are to making those green investments that fundamentally transform the production process. But that is not sustainable if China undercuts our steel by underpricing and does so with production processes that are the most emissions intensive in the world. And so that is why these tariffs are necessary to give our industry the ability to make those investments and compete fairly. And that is one of the elements that's critical to making progress.
So speaking of making progress, a lot of my friends in the climate community, while cheering on much of the announcements, are really concerned about what it means to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles at a moment when U.S. manufacturers might then use the excuse of the tariffs not to speed up their own deployment of EV vehicles here in the U.S. How are we making certain that that's not the case and that we continue to increase our percentage of electric vehicles being made in America and become a dominant force in the global market on EV?
So as I think you noted this earlier, we have a whole of government approach on this front. So the tariffs are a part of a integrated set of policies that work together. Our car manufacturers, our battery manufacturers, foreign battery manufacturers that are making investments here in the U.S., they have access to very important credits, tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. There are conversion grants from the Department of Energy. Those things provide really powerful incentives. And of course, we see huge take-up on the part of our automakers, a huge excitement on the part of our auto workers. And then, of course, we also have tailpipe emission standards that put forward, help the industry coalesce around a path forward that's going to get us from here to there, and incentives for consumers so that they realize those really important cost savings that make these investments in electrified vehicles of one form or another really huge cost savers for them. Those things all work together, and the tariffs are a necessary component to make sure that those investments don't get undercut by unfair competition.
So sometimes one of the great things about America, and the reason why we are always able to continue to innovate and move towards progress, is that we have wonderful amnesia. We forget the traumas of the past and move on. We're not burdened by history like some of our friends are across the pond. But one of the challenges that we have in America is that we have wonderful amnesia, and we sometimes forget the traumas of the past and don't learn entirely the right lessons from them. One of the aspects of the announcement made on tariffs is on medical supplies. We all remember, of course, during the PPE shortage crisis in this country, we and so many of our partners understood that we were over-reliant on Chinese manufacturing as it relates to medical supplies. Can you help us to understand how how through these tariffs and other policies that are enacted by this administration, we're learning all the right lessons from COVID and applying them in this moment?
Yeah, so of course, when the president took office, our supply chains were fundamentally broken. They were broken in medical equipment, life-saving PPE. They were broken in semiconductors, as we talked, really across the board. And so the administration spent a lot of time really understanding these supply chains, connecting suppliers with sources of information. We are in a much better place today in general. As you saw with the tragedy in Baltimore with the bridge, there was an ability, because we had a standing group of private sector and public sector actors that were sharing information with each other. They were able to redirect shipments pretty quickly. So that is also true in the case of medical equipment. So they identified tools that we could use to make sure, for instance, the Defense Production Act, to make sure that we could have some domestic manufacturing of some of those vital medical equipment, procurement policies. So they put in place a number of these policies, but it turned out in some cases where where manufacturers did make investments in the US, it just wasn't enough because they were undercut by declining prices in imports that were coming in from China. And that is why, after a lot of really detailed work, the decision was taken to increase tariffs on just a few categories: syringes and masks of certain types, gloves, to ensure that the incentives that we have in place are coupled with some protections to make sure that those investments can actually work. Again, we don't want to own those supply chains. We won't and shouldn't, but we certainly want to diversify them.
So I have to open this up for questions from our audience and I think from some journalists as well. But I'm going to quickly cheat at the end here and see if I can get two questions in for the price of one at the end. You mentioned a few times the failings by the previous administration as it relates to China and the tariffs. But I remember when the announcement was made by the previous administration about $350 billion worth of goods that would have tariffs imposed on them. It was kind of like, wall-to-wall news. There's been less attention paid this time. Maybe it's because folks have been socialized already to the notion of tariffs against China. But I wonder if you could just succinctly help everyone understand the distinction between these tariffs and what's been imposed in the recent past and the effectiveness of the mobilization of an all-of-government approach to the follow-up versus what happened in the past. And then lastly, here's the two for the price of one. Help the average person understand why on earth they should care about any of this stuff and why it matters for them.
Yeah. So in terms of for the average American, I think Americans have seen that they don't want their country to be dependent on a foreign supplier for anything that's really important to them. They saw that when the price of gasoline spiked when Russia invaded Ukraine, when the price of food spiked when Russia invaded Ukraine. They saw it when they couldn't buy cars at all, except with massive price premiums during the pandemic. So I think people understand at some basic level that we need to have American producers in the mix, international diversification, and of course, Americans who live near a manufacturing plant, where jobs were shipped overseas during the China shock, they really understand what we're doing here. In terms of the difference, this set of tariffs is following a very extensive review of China's practices. You can see the detailed analysis that USTR released. It's pretty chilling. Makes clear that these practices in many cases have gotten worse rather than better. And again, it's coupled with investments. So you'll remember that, the previous president went to Racine, Wisconsin and said, we're going to, get this huge $10 billion Foxconn facility. They bulldozed 100 homes. And I think there's really maybe one or two buildings there, but nothing really happened. Contrast that with, the president was just in Racine with Microsoft talking about a over $3 billion investment in a data center and 100,000, training commitments for the local community. And then you couple that with the kinds of announcements that we're also going to enforce specifically on tariffs on semiconductors. And you can see that that is a really well thought through whole of government approach that stands a chance of making a material change in our landscape in factory towns around the country.
Thank you, Lael. Questions?
Good to see you, Lael. We go back to your days at Brookings. My name is Hilton Root from George Mason University. Do you believe that there are tax incentives that motivate American companies to invest overseas rather than in the U.S.? And if so, what plans do you have in mind to the tax code to change that?
So I think on the international tax front, the most important thing is that the Secretary of Treasury negotiated an incredibly important global minimum tax. It's been adopted by so many of our peers around the world, and it is designed explicitly to address precisely this problem. It is designed to ensure that when multinationals decide where to expand production, where to invest, they do it on the basis of the local business environment, and they don't do it on the basis of a race to the bottom tax competition, because that's bad for everybody. It undercuts the local revenue base, so makes it less possible for those local jurisdictions to make the necessary public investments. And it also distorts the investment and employment decision. So the one thing that I think we have emphasized in the president's budget the most on this front is that it's very important for the U.S. To join and implement a global minimum tax. We have actually proposed raising that global minimum tax to the same level as our proposed corporate minimum tax to keep an even playing field there. And we would just really encourage Congress to move forward with the global minimum tax, because other countries are putting it in place, and it will actually disadvantage us if we do not move to do the same.
I'm going to take a question from our online audience.
Yep.
From Emily Peck from Axios, how are the administration's investments to spur manufacturing and clean energy different from the efforts that China undertakes to boost their own industries?
Yeah, so I think there are so many very important distinctions. One of the important distinctions that you'll see that is very clear in the USTR report is that China engages in systematic efforts to acquire foreign intellectual property and technology through really illegal means, whether it be forced technology transfer from foreign companies through cyber theft and through other mechanisms. So I think that is one of the really glaring differences that is undercuts everything that we think is important about trading fairly, fair competition. In terms of the way that we have secured incentives, those incentives very much are catalytic. They are government enabled, but they are private sector led. So if you look at what has happened under the Inflation Reduction Act, the large majority of that nearly $200 billion worth of investment right now, that is all private investment taking advantage of particular tax credits. So we're very much focused on providing incentives, but then having competitive markets determine exactly which investments those go to. And you can see that there's a transferability mechanism, and we have taxpayers signing up to participate in 60,000 clean energy projects that have been registered for the Inflation Reduction Act. Very different than directing sort of central government subsidies, and the scale is really incomparable.
Appreciate that question from Axios. Do we have any other questions from reporters who are either online or in person before taking a final audience question? I know that our NEC leader needs to get back to her other duties.
We have one more online from Ari Hawkins from Politico.
Yeah, and we have a journalist in here too. So we'll take one online and one in-house.
Yep. Can you elaborate on the role of Mexico? What tweaks to the USMCA are you considering, and do they relate to rules of origin?
So I would say that, of course, we are currently very engaged and very productively so with Mexico on addressing current transshipment problems, for instance, in the steel area. So that's our immediate set of interactions. To the extent that there are more systemic challenges that arise, we think about 2026 review as being the opportunity to address those, to find areas where perhaps the USMCA was not sufficiently well engineered to address those areas of potentially rules of origin, potentially other areas, and that agenda will become more defined as we get closer to the date.
And a final press question here.
Thank you. The International Monetary Fund this morning said that the announcement that was made by the administration will cause trade restriction, and urged the administration to work with China because this will affect the global economy. Next month, President Biden will be traveling to the G7. So could you zoom out a little bit on how he plans to address this with his allies, the G7 and the G20 allies, because each country have different relationship with China? Thank you.
Yes. So we are already having conversations with other G7 members who have raised similar concerns about Chinese industrial overcapacity and unfair, underpriced export surges in certain industrial sectors. In fact, some of those G7 members have initiated trade investigations of their own in some of the same sectors. So we do anticipate that the president will want to, and the other members of the G7 will want to have a discussion about how to address these problems and work together to address them because they are, I think, shared among all members of the G7. And also, there are a number of countries in the G20, like Brazil, who's taken action motivated by a similar set of concerns about Chinese unfair practices.
Lael, we are really fortunate to have your brilliant and committed public service. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And we hope we get to see you soon again.